The wind doesn't sound like the wind back home. Earth's winds have a kind of melody, sharp, whistling gusts through canyon walls or the rustling of leaves in trees. Here on Titan, the wind is a guttural groan, a deep and endless drone that rolls through the walls of our station like some immense alien throat. It's as if the moon itself is trying to speak, but the words are buried beneath the methane-rich haze and the icy crust. And yet, for all its strangeness, I can't stop listening. I've been here for 5 days, and already the usual sounds of human activity seem far off next to the immense presence of Titan. I watch the storm churn outside the viewing window as I sip a mug of coffee that never quite tastes right in the filtered air of the habitat. The storm isn't visible. Titan's atmosphere is too thick, too opaque for that, but the instruments buzz with urgency, painting it in data. A swirling vortex of wind and hydrocarbon rain, methane droplets falling like liquid glass. Somewhere in that chaos, the voices began. It started yesterday. Just a crackle of interference on the recording, something almost human but not quite. At first I thought it was just static, natural for this environment. But then the tone shifted, the cadence too intentional to ignore. It chilled me in a way that the freezing winds outside never could. I haven't told the others. Not yet. I'm still trying to make sense of it myself. Titan's storms are like no other weather in the solar system, Commander Henry Walker had said during our first briefing on the station. His voice was calm, authoritative, the kind of voice that could order you into an oxygen-depleted environment without hesitation. They're powerful, unpredictable, and entirely indifferent to human life. Respect them, or they'll kill you. That sentiment seems to encapsulate everything about Titan. Indifference. The world doesn't care that we've come to study it, to mine its secrets. It's the same feeling I had standing on the deck of a research vessel in the Arctic, staring at the ice-choked sea. Nature has no malice, no agenda. It simply is. And yet there's something in Titan's winds that doesn't feel indifferent. It feels alive. The station is quieter than it should be for 5 people. Everyone is busy with their respective tasks. Brandon Morris in the biolab running tests on samples from the methane lakes. Elen Rivers fine-tuning the environmental systems to keep the cold at bay. Ryan Rossi monitoring the drones we've sent out into the storm. The only sound is the whir of machinery and the occasional creak of the station as the methane-rich winds outside batter the structure. It's too quiet, I think. Too easy for thoughts to bounce around. I pull up the audio files again, replaying the segment from yesterday. The hiss of static fills my ears, a sound I've grown so accustomed to it barely registers. Then it comes. The muted rise and fall of a cadence that doesn't belong. I adjust the filters, isolating the frequencies. I'm not sure what I'm expecting to find, but the impulse to dig deeper is irresistible. "Hey, Foster." Ryan's voice cuts through the quiet, and I flinch slightly, turning in my chair. He's leaning against the doorway, a half-eaten protein bar in his hand, still staring at that storm data. "Something like that," I reply, keeping my tone casual. I minimize the audio file before he can get a look. Ryan steps into the room, his presence a welcome distraction from the solitude of my thoughts. He's the kind of guy who can make a bad situation tolerable, always quick with a joke or a quip. But even his humor has been subdued since we landed here. Titan has that effect on people. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he says, raising an eyebrow. "Don't tell me you're spooked by a little wind." "Just trying to make sense of some anomalies," I say, deflecting. "There's a lot of interference in the recordings. Could be a malfunction. Or it could be nothing," he offers, plopping into a chair across from me. "This place messes with your head. You wouldn't be the first to imagine things out here." His words stick with me, though I brush them off with a non-committal grunt. Imagining things. That's the rational explanation, isn't it? Isolation, stress, the psychological effects of being so far from home. I've studied these phenomena in other people, catalogued the symptoms. But this doesn't feel imagined. It feels too real. By the time the storm reaches its peak, the entire station is buzzing with activity. Commander Walker is in the central hub, monitoring the sensors and coordinating the drones as they collect data. His calm demeanor is unshaken, his focus absolute. I've always admired that about him, even if his authority can feel stifling at times. "How's it looking out there?" I ask as I step into the room, drawn by the energy of the moment. "Winds are peaking at 110 meters per second," he replies without looking up from the console. "One of the drones is showing stress on its stabilizers, but it should hold." "Anything unusual in the data?" I try to sound casual, but my heart is pounding. "Nothing yet, just the usual chaos." He glances at me then, his piercing gaze seeming to weigh my intentions. "Why?" "No reason," I lie. "Just curious." He doesn't press further, but the tension in his eyes tells me he's already bracing for something to go wrong. Titan has a way of keeping us all on edge. The night falls heavy on the station, though night is a relative term here. The dim orange haze outside darkens slightly, and the artificial lights of the habitat take over. I retreat to my quarters, hoping the familiar rituals of rest, brushing my teeth, setting my alarm, will ground me. But sleep doesn't come easily. The wind is louder now, a roar that seeps through the walls, making the station creak and groan. It's almost rhythmic, I think, as I lie there staring at the ceiling. Almost like... No. I push the thought away. The next morning, I'm back at my workstation, replaying the audio from the storm. The anomaly is still there, clearer this time. I isolate the segment, looping it over and over until the shape of it becomes undeniable. It's a voice. And then, just as I'm about to call it quits, something new emerges. A scream. It's sharp, raw, and full of a pain that makes my skin crawl. I stop the playback, my pulse racing. I know I should tell the others, I should share this data and let the team analyze it together. But something holds me back. A part of me feels possessive of this discovery. Another part fears they'll dismiss it, chalk it up to an overactive imagination or a glitch in the equipment. I need more evidence. I need to be sure. By midday, the storm begins to die down, and the station falls into an uneasy calm. Brandon and Elen are in the biolab discussing the latest samples, their voices muffled through the thin walls. I consider joining them, if only to escape the pull of the recordings, but the thought of trying to explain what I've found feels exhausting. Instead, I turn my attention back to the audio, running it through every filter and algorithm I can think of. Hours pass, the light outside shifting imperceptibly as Titan rotates beneath Saturn's shadow. And then I find patterns. The voice isn't random. It's structured, following a rhythm that matches the cadence of human speech. My breath catches as I stare at the screen. I lean back in my chair, rubbing my temples. The rational part of me screams for caution. This could be an error, a coincidence, some natural phenomenon we don't yet understand. But another part, the part that's always chased the unknown, that's driven me to the farthest reaches of the solar system, knows better. The human brain is an incredible pattern recognition machine, but it has its flaws. It sees shapes in the clouds, faces in shadows, meaning in randomness. That's what I kept telling myself as I stared at the oscillating waves on my monitor. I sat in the small lab, surrounded by the noise of equipment and the vibrations of the storm still raging outside. Titan's wind never truly stopped. It merely ebbed and flowed, like the beating of a distant alien heart. The recordings I'd been obsessing over for the past few days seemed to align with it, the voices rising and falling as if they were part of the storm itself. No, not part of the storm. Something carried within it. "Are you going to spend all day in here?" Ryan's voice jolted me out of my thoughts. I turned to find him leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, an easy grin plastered across his face. He was one of those people who could make anything seem less dire, his casual confidence cutting through tension like a warm knife. Maybe, I replied, trying to sound less defensive than I felt. There's a lot to analyze. He tilted his head, giving me a curious look. You've been pretty laser-focused on those audio files. Something interesting. I wanted to tell him, to share the weight of this discovery, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't have enough to make it real, not enough to convince him, or myself. Just interference, I said finally. Static from the storm, trying to filter it out. Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't push. Well, don't work yourself into a meltdown. You've seen what this place can do to people. His words hung in the air long after he left. Titan does get to people. The isolation, the endless darkness, the oppressive cold. It's the perfect breeding ground for paranoia. Was I falling victim to it already? Imagining voices in the wind, seeing meaning where there was none? Or was I hearing something real? That night, the wind was louder than usual. A low, mournful howl that seemed to press against the station walls. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to its rhythm. There was something almost musical about it. A cadence. I closed my eyes and tried to tune it out, but instead I heard the voices again. I sat up abruptly, heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from the intercom system. I grabbed my tablet and hurried to the lab. When I pulled up the live audio feed from the storm, the voices were there, clearer than before. They weren't random. They were speaking. I adjusted the filters, isolating the frequencies, and played the segment on a loop. The voice was distorted by the storm, but I could make out fragments of words, languages. Some I recognized, Latin, Greek, even bits of English. Others were completely foreign, alien sounds that made my skin crawl. What the hell was I hearing? By morning, the tension in the station was heavy. Brandon had been unusually quiet, his usual affable demeanor replaced by a kind of distracted unease. Elen was tense too, her movements sharp and precise as she worked on calibrating the environmental systems. Even Ryan seemed subdued, his usual humor replaced by a quiet vigilance. Commander Walker was the only one who seemed unaffected. He moved through the central hub with the calm air of someone who had faced worse situations than this. I envied his composure, though it didn't make him any easier to talk to. I decided to approach Brandon first. He was in the biolab, leaning over a microscope. The air in the lab was heavy with the chemical aroma of preservatives and samples. Brandon, I said, keeping my voice low, have you noticed anything unusual? He looked up, his expression guarded. Unusual how? In the storm, I said carefully. The audio recordings. Have you heard anything strange? He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. I've been hearing things, he admitted. Voices, but it's probably just the wind. Have you told anyone? I asked. No, he said quickly. It's nothing, just stress, you know? This place gets to you. I wanted to push him further, to ask what exactly he'd heard, but something in his expression stopped me. He looked afraid, not just of the voices, but of what admitting to them might mean. As the day wore on, the storm outside began to intensify. The station creaked and groaned under the strain, the wind howling like a living thing. I tried to lose myself in my work, analyzing the latest data from the drones, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the voices. By late afternoon, Elen snapped. It started with her pacing in the central hub, muttering under her breath. At first, I thought she was talking to herself, but then I realized she was arguing with someone who wasn't there. Elen! Walker's voice cut through the tension, calm and authoritative. What's going on? She whirled around, her eyes wide. They're in the storm, she said. They're trying to get in. Who's trying to get in? Walker asked, his tone measured. The voices, she said. Don't you hear them? They're everywhere. They're inside. Elen, Walker said firmly. You need to calm down, take a breath. But she didn't calm down. She started screaming, her hands clawing at her ears as if trying to block out a sound only she could hear. It took all three of us, Walker, Brandon, and me, to restrain her long enough to sedate her. She collapsed into unconsciousness, her breathing shallow but steady. We carried her to the medbay and strapped her to the cot, her body eerily still. I stood there for a long time, staring at her motionless face, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "They're not real," Walker said behind me. "Whatever she's hearing, it's not real." "How do you know that?" I asked, turning to face him. "Because there's no evidence to suggest otherwise," he said. "We're under extreme stress in an extreme environment. This is psychological, nothing more." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But the voices in the storm told me otherwise. That night I stayed in the lab, replaying the recordings over and over again. The voices were becoming more coherent. I could hear individual words now, phrases that seemed to plead and beg. "Help us. Let us out. Please." The desperation in their tone was unmistakable, and it sent a chill down my spine. What were they? Ghosts, echoes, something else entirely? I sat there for hours, the voices filling my ears, the weight of their presence crushing. By the time I finally crawled into bed, I was too exhausted to think. But even in sleep, the storm found me. I dreamed of Titan, but it wasn't the Titan I knew. The methane lakes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and the wind carried voices, thousands of them, all speaking at once, their cries rising and falling like a tide. I stood on the edge of the Kraken Mare, staring into its black, glassy surface. And then the surface broke, and a hand reached out, clawing at the ice, dragging itself free. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the sound of the wind still ringing in my ears. It took me a moment to remember where I was, to ground myself in the familiar confines of the station. But the dream lingered, its images burned into my mind. I hadn't slept well in days, but I didn't need sleep to hear them anymore. The voices had slipped past the walls of the storm and into the station, into the corridors, and worst of all, into me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel them. Not just the sound of them, but their weight, their presence. They weren't just carried by the storm, they were the storm. The station's atmosphere had shifted. There was an unspoken tension, a shared but unacknowledged fear that none of us wanted to put into words. Commander Walker held his composure, but I could see the cracks forming, his movements slightly more rigid, his voice a fraction sharper when issuing commands. Brandon kept to himself, burying his unease in whatever work he could find, though his avoidance of eye contact betrayed him. Even Ryan had stopped joking around. His presence, once a source of levity, had grown muted, as though the storm had stolen his voice too. Elen remained unconscious in the medbay, her breathing shallow and irregular. I checked on her often, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I was hoping she'd wake up with an explanation. Or maybe I just needed to remind myself that she was still alive, that the storm hadn't taken her completely. I spent most of my time in the lab, combing through the data we'd collected from the drones and the atmospheric sensors. I ran analysis after analysis, mapping the patterns, trying to make sense of the voices. And that's when I understood. They weren't just voices. They were minds. The audio patterns I'd been studying weren't just noise, they were brainwaves. I cross-referenced the data with human neural activity, and the match was chilling. The voices weren't random phenomena or echoes of the storm. They were thoughts, fragmented pieces of consciousness carried on the methane winds. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. This wasn't possible. It shouldn't be possible. And yet, the data didn't lie. "What is this?" Brandon's voice startled me, and I realized he was standing in the doorway watching me. I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what I'd found. "It's something in the storm. The voices, they're not just noise, they're patterns, signals." "What kind of signals?" he pressed, stepping closer. "Brainwaves," I said quietly. "They match human neural activity." He stared at me. "You're saying the storm is alive?" "Not alive," I said quickly. "At least, not in the way we understand. But there's something in it. Something intelligent." Brandon didn't respond. He just stood there staring at the screen as though it might explain the unexplainable. Then, without a word, he turned and left the room. By the time I caught up with him, he was in the central hub, confronting Commander Walker. Ryan stood nearby, his expression wary but curious. "Foster's found something," Brandon was saying, his voice strained. "The storm, it's carrying minds, consciousness. He has the data to prove it." Walker frowned, his gaze shifting to me. "Is this true?" I nodded, though my throat felt dry. "The audio patterns match human brainwave activity. It's not just interference, it's something else, something real." Walker was silent for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. Then he shook his head. "This is nonsense. The stress is getting to you." "It's not nonsense," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "The data doesn't lie. Whatever's in the storm, it's intelligent. It's trying to communicate." "And you're sure this isn't just pareidolia, seeing patterns where there are none?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. Walker's expression hardened. "Even if you're right, it doesn't change our mission. We're here to study Titan, not chase ghosts. Focus on your work." His dismissal stung, but it wasn't surprising. Walker wasn't the kind of man to entertain unprovable theories, no matter how compelling the evidence. Still, his words did little to quell the growing tension in the station. That night, Brandon disappeared. The storm had returned, its howling winds rattling the station as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The voices were louder now, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but they only became more insistent, more desperate. And then I heard a distant scream. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The sound had come from the corridor. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the hall. I checked the medbay first, but Elen was still there, her breathing steady but shallow. It wasn't until I reached Brandon's quarters that I realized something was wrong. The door was ajar and the room was empty. His belongings were still there, but he was gone. "Brandon!" I called out. No response. I searched the station from top to bottom, my anxiety mounting with every passing minute. Ryan and Walker joined the search, their faces grim. But it was no use. Brandon was nowhere to be found. The airlock log told the rest of the story. He'd gone outside. We stood in the central hub, staring at the screen in silence. The storm outside was too violent to send a drone, let alone a search party. Even if we could have gone after him, it wouldn't have mattered. Titan was unforgiving, and no one could survive out there for long. "What was he thinking?" Ryan muttered. "The storm got to him," Walker said grimly, "just like it got to Elen." I didn't say anything, but I knew he was wrong. Brandon hadn't just lost his mind. He'd been drawn out there, pulled by something in the storm, and deep down I knew what had pulled him. The voices. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the station became suffocating. Walker tried to maintain order, but even he couldn't deny that something was deeply wrong. Elen's condition had worsened. She muttered incoherently in her sleep, her words a garbled mix of languages both familiar and foreign. Ryan kept to himself, his once confident demeanor replaced by a quiet, haunted look. And me, I couldn't stop hearing the voices. They weren't just random anymore. They spoke to me directly, calling me by name, whispering secrets they couldn't possibly know. They spoke of my past, my fears, my regrets. And they begged for release. "Help us," they whispered. "Free us." I tried to block them out, but it was impossible. They were everywhere. In the wind, in the walls, in my mind. They weren't just asking for help. They were demanding it. Ryan burst into the lab one evening, a tablet clutched tightly in his hands, his face damp with sweat. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by wide, panicked eyes that darted to the door as though checking if we were alone. "You need to see this," he said. "What is it?" I asked, already rising from my seat. "Just come with me," he said, motioning toward the central hub. By the time we reached the hub, my nerves were raw. Ryan pulled up a series of files on the central display, his hands moving quickly over the interface. These are old transmission logs," he said, his words tumbling over one another. "From missions to Titan that were supposedly terminated, I dug them out of the station's archive. I wasn't even sure they'd still be here. The logs were dated decades before our arrival, missions I'd only vaguely heard about, early attempts to explore Titan that had ended abruptly, their crews presumed lost. The first file opened, distorted and barely audible through the layers of interference. A voice emerged, faint and broken, but clearly human. "Please," it said, the words stretching out like a thin thread, fraying at the edges. "Don't leave us here." The next log was worse. Multiple voices overlapped, garbled and desperate, cutting in and out of static. Some screamed, others wept, and some spoke in calm, eerie tones that made my skin crawl. One voice whispered repeatedly, "They're inside us! Inside!" Ryan ran his hand over his face, his breathing unsteady. "You hear that, right? Those voices, they match the ones we've been hearing in the storm." I leaned in closer, my pulse pounding in my ears as I replayed the recordings in my head, comparing them to the voices I'd been studying. He was right. The cadence and intonations were the same. "These people," I said slowly, "they're part of the storm now." "It's not just them," Ryan said, his voice breaking. He switched to another file. This one wasn't in English. The words were guttural, clicking and alien. "This isn't a language we know, but I ran it through the same filters you've been using on the storm recordings." He pulled up a visual representation of the sound waves, overlaid with the data from the storm. They aligned perfectly. "These voices are from something else," he said. "Something that's been here long before us." My stomach churned as the pieces began to fall into place. The voices weren't just random phenomena. They weren't just human. The storm carried fragments of consciousness, not just from lost crews like ours, but from something far older. Beings we couldn't even begin to understand. I took a step back, my knees weak. Titan isn't just a moon, it's a trap, a prison. Ryan nodded, his eyes dark with fear. "And now it has us too." The storm showed no sign of stopping. If anything, it had gained strength. It howled outside the station, a tireless, thunderous force that made the walls shudder and groan. Inside, we were crumbling too. Elen was gone. I'd checked on her in the medbay that morning and found the cot empty, her restraints undone. The security logs showed she'd opened the airlock in the middle of the night, walking into the storm without so much as a suit. Ryan and I had watched the footage in silence. The image of her figure disappearing into the haze burned into my mind. "We're next," Ryan said quietly. He wasn't wrong. Brandon had vanished first, now Elen. It was only a matter of time before the storm claimed the rest of us. Commander Walker was the last to pretend everything was normal. He moved through the station with a rigid, mechanical precision, issuing orders no one followed and performing routines no one cared about. But even he couldn't ignore the voices. "Do you hear them?" I asked him once as we sat in the central hub, watching the storm data scroll across the monitors. "No," he said curtly, his eyes fixed on the screen. "You're lying!" He didn't respond, but his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He was hearing them too. He just wouldn't admit it. "They're not going to stop," I said. "They're inside the storm, inside us. You know that, don't you?" Walker turned to me, his expression hard. "We're not giving in," he said. "Whatever this is, we fight it." "And then what?" I asked. "What are we fighting? What's the plan, Commander? You don't even know what's out there." His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. He didn't have to. We both knew the truth. There was no fighting this. There was no escaping it. Ryan was the next to go. It happened while I was in the lab, poring over the data one last time, trying to find some clue, some answer, some way to stop this. I didn't hear him leave. When I checked his quarters, they were empty, his bed untouched. The airlock logs confirmed it. He'd stepped outside less than an hour ago, vanishing into the storm like the others. I stood in the airlock for a long time, staring at the hatch, the storm battering against the other side. I thought about opening it, about following him out there. The whispers were so loud now, so close. They spoke in languages I didn't understand, in voices I didn't recognize, but some of them sounded familiar. Brandon, Elen, Ryan. Their words were fractured, broken, overlapping with hundreds, thousands of others. But they were there. They were part of the storm now. Walker lasted longer than I expected. Long enough that I started to wonder if he might actually survive this. But the storm didn't care about willpower or discipline or authority. It only cared that you were here, that you'd heard it. And once you'd heard it, it was already too late. I found him in the central hub, staring at the monitors, the same data looping endlessly on the screens. He didn't even look at me when I approached. "It's calling me," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "I can hear them." I didn't say anything. What was there to say? We both knew how this ended. He turned to me then, his eyes meeting mine. "Do you understand what it is?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure how to answer, but then I realized I did understand. Not fully, not completely, but enough. "It's a trap," I said. "A prison for consciousness, for minds. It's been here for billions of years, collecting everything, every voice, every thought, every memory. It's all in the storm." "And us?" he asked. "We're already part of it," I said. "It's just waiting to take the rest." Walker nodded slowly, as if that was the answer he'd been expecting. Then, without another word, he stood and walked out of the room. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. When I checked the airlock logs an hour later, his name was there, the timestamp marking the moment he'd stepped outside. I was alone now, or at least I should have been. But I wasn't. The voices kept me company, filling the silence, pressing against my mind like a constant, crushing weight. I'd stopped trying to block them out. There was no point. I sat in the central hub, staring at the monitors, my thoughts sluggish and disjointed. The storm data scrolled across the screens, meaningless now. I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I already had them. The voices were human, alien, both. They were fragments of minds, stolen and stored by something ancient, something incomprehensible. The storm wasn't a storm. It was a medium, a vessel, a way to carry the voices across the planet, across time. And I could feel it pulling me in, breaking me down until I was nothing but a voice in the wind. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. I was tired, so tired, and the storm felt inevitable, like gravity, like sleep, like death. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking to the airlock or opening the hatch. I only remember the wind, the cold, the endless orange haze that swallowed me as I stepped outside. The voices surrounded me, louder than ever, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. And then, slowly, they began to make sense. They weren't just voices, they were memories, lives. I saw flashes of alien worlds, of civilizations long gone, their histories written in light and sound and thought. I felt their emotions, fear, joy, pain, longing. So vivid, so raw, they felt like my own. And then I saw the humans, the ones who had come before us. Their faces, their voices, their stories. They were all here, all part of the storm, their consciousness dissolved into the endless chorus. And then I felt myself slipping. My thoughts, my memories, my identity was unraveling, scattering into the wind. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I was part of something vast, something eternal, something I couldn't begin to comprehend. My last coherent thought was a single word, whispered into the storm: help. Somewhere far away the storm continued to howl, and in its winds a new voice joined the chorus.